June 4th, 1943, Mexia, Texas. A pencil shook slightly in the hand of Unifritzer Burkhardt as he scribbled into a secret notebook hidden beneath his army blanket. If anyone in his own unit found it, he knew what would happen. Solitary confinement, maybe worse. But he couldn't stay silent anymore. "The Americans must be lying," he wrote. "No country could live like this in the middle of a world war." Only minutes earlier, he had pressed his face to the window of the troop train and seen something that shattered 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Outside, Texas glowed. Every farmhouse, every diner, every small-town street corner shimmered with electric light, a river of brightness rolling across the plains at 10 o'clock at night. Germany had been in darkness since 1940, its cities forced into blackout. Even before the war, only 1 in 5 German farms had electricity. Yet here, in a land they'd been told was collapsing, light flowed as freely as air. When the train stopped, 1,150 men of Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped down. They weren't packed into cattle cars or marched off like animals. They were carried in Pullman coaches, with soft seats, dining service, and sleeping berths. And as they emerged, the people of Mexia came to watch. Hundreds of locals, quiet and curious, lining the platform to see the enemy who had fought them halfway across the world. What no one realized in that moment was that history was shifting. Not through guns or speeches, but through what these soldiers were seeing with their own eyes. The myth of Nazi superiority was starting to crumble, undone not by battle, but by the overwhelming proof of American abundance. The psychological collapse had begun weeks earlier, in Tunisia, when General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's successor, surrendered nearly 250,000 German and Italian troops. The desert fighters who had once pushed the British back to Egypt, men who carried the Iron Cross and the pride of the Wehrmacht, were now captives of the very nation they'd been told was weak and dying. Among them was Friedrich Radke, veteran of France and North Africa, twice wounded, decorated for bravery. As he looked out over the lights of Texas that night, he, like many others, began to understand. This war had already been lost, long before the fighting stopped. His diary, uncovered decades later in the National Archives, would become one of the most revealing records ever found about what it truly felt like to be a German soldier held in American hands. The path from defeat to awakening began far from Texas, at the port of Oran in Algeria. There, Friedrich Radke and nearly 30,000 other prisoners waited in dusty holding camps for ships that would carry them across the Atlantic. Even before they left Africa, the Americans were already dismantling years of Nazi belief. Not through words, but through sheer efficiency. Thousands of men were processed every single day, with a speed and precision the Wehrmacht itself had never managed. Every prisoner photographed, identification cards filed, medical exams completed, injections given, and most surprising of all, every man briefed on his rights under the Geneva Convention, spoken in fluent German by American officers who had trained specifically for this task. Then came the first real shock. The food Oberreiter Hans Müller, a tank officer captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later, still astonished. "At Oran, while we waited for the ships, they fed us better than we'd eaten in half a year of fighting. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was some kind of trick. Propaganda, maybe. Only later did we learn that this was their ordinary army ration. The ships that would carry them were marvels themselves. Liberty ships, built in American yards faster than anyone thought possible. The SS Robert E. Peary, for example, had been assembled in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. To German soldiers used to shortages and delays, that kind of productivity sounded like fantasy. Yet, these vessels were real, and they came off the lines at a rate of 3 per day. Each one returned from Europe loaded not with weapons, but with prisoners, nearly 30,000 men every month by the summer of 1943. The 2-week voyage that followed became the second stage of their quiet transformation. One soldier, Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division, kept a meticulous record in letters home after the war. He couldn't get over what he saw on deck each day. The crew threw away more food in one afternoon than my entire company received in a week. Half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, milk poured out because it was no longer fresh. They weren't mocking us. They simply didn't think it mattered. For men raised in the shadow of rationing and scarcity, that casual abundance was more than shocking. It was the beginning of doubt. The unshakable certainty of Nazi superiority was fading, replaced by a new and uneasy realization. The enemy they'd been taught to despise might actually be stronger, freer, and far more capable than they had ever imagined. Their sense of disbelief only deepened with each passing day. To the captured men, it seemed as though the Americans possessed no limits at all. Even the ships themselves felt like floating lessons in industrial power. They soon learned that the very vessel carrying them was just one of 2,710 Liberty ships built during the war, each made of 250,000 parts drawn from 32 different states. Talkative guards explained how even the engines were pieced together from factories scattered across the country. One plant forging pistons, another machining cylinders, a third assembling them into roaring 900-horsepower giants, all in shipyards that hadn't even existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, a proud Prussian officer whose ancestors had fought in every German war since Frederick the Great, later described the moment his faith began to crack. "As we neared the American coast," he wrote, "I watched a radar antenna turning slowly above the bridge. We believed such equipment belonged only to us, and perhaps the British, and only in small numbers. Yet here it was, standard gear on a cargo ship. That was the moment I knew. Germany had already lost." When their convoy finally reached Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia, on August 2, 1943, the last illusions of Nazi propaganda were swept away. The base stretched as far as the eye could see. 4,300 acres of docks, cranes and warehouses humming with motion, towering gantries loaded and unloaded dozens of vessels at once, the air filled with the rhythm of power. In a single day, this one port handled more cargo than Hamburg could manage in an entire week. Gerhard Johann Weber, once a factory laborer in the Ruhr, later wrote in his hidden notebook, "I counted 47 cargo ships being worked at the same time. Each crane did the labor of 12 men and horses back home. Everything ran on electricity. No coal smoke, no choking fumes, only movement, constant and effortless." When the prisoners finally disembarked, they were organized into marching columns toward waiting trains. Along the route, they passed endless parking lots filled with cars. Not officials' limousines or military trucks, but ordinary automobiles belonging to dock workers. To the Germans, the sight was almost surreal. At home, a private car was still the privilege of the wealthy or the party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to every German family since 1934, remained little more than a slogan. Fewer than 1,000 had ever been delivered. But here, the common laborer drove himself to work. And then came the final shock. The trains. No boxcars, no iron wagons built for 40 men or 8 horses. Instead, Pullman coaches, passenger cars with padded seats that folded into sleeping berths. The kind of comfort most German officers had never known, now offered to their prisoners. For many of them, that short ride deeper into America would become the quietest, most humbling journey of their lives. The journey that followed felt nothing like captivity. Inside the trains, there were dining cars with white linens and polished silver, and observation coaches with wide glass windows opening to the American landscape. Friedrich Radke later wrote, "Zeit BTT an TT Anton Titantis, Fars We boarded like tourists, not prisoners. Even the American guards seemed slightly uneasy about the comfort. One sergeant apologized because the air conditioning wasn't working properly. Air conditioning in August. For men who had fought in desert heat and slept under sand-blown tents, it felt unreal, a luxury they'd believed was reserved for Hitler's personal train. That 3-day ride from Norfolk to the Ytri camps of Texas and Oklahoma would do more to dismantle Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat ever could. As the trains rolled through Virginia and the Carolinas, the prisoners crowded at the windows, staring in silence at a nation that should not have existed. Not according to everything they'd been told. Every small town shimmered with light. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, places that, in Germany, might have had a single dim street lamp now glowed with shop windows, neon signs and homes lit in every room. Neon signs and homes lit in every room. They passed factories working through the night, their windows bright, their parking lots full even at midnight. It was abundance made visible, energy without limit. Obergefreiter Meyer, whose father had been a Nazi party block leader in Hamburg, would later write in a letter discovered decades later. That first night, we crossed dozens of cities. Each one had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us it had been this way since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just smiled and said, "You'll see." When the train paused in Roanoke, Virginia, for water and coal, the lesson continued. From their windows, the Germans watched American railway workers move with an effortless rhythm. Engines refueled, cars inspected, orders shouted and obeyed. All in half an hour. Radke noted quietly to himself. In Germany, the same task would have taken 2 hours. It was in these small moments, the lights, the comfort, the quiet competence, that something far greater was happening. The foundations of belief, built over years of propaganda, were beginning to crumble. At the Roanoke rail yard, the Germans saw machines doing the work of men. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems. Every motion, every hiss of steam and hum of current spoke of a country that had mastered efficiency on a scale they could hardly imagine. What struck them even more wasn't just the machinery, it was the people operating it. The American workers moved with easy confidence, dressed in sturdy leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola straight from glass bottles, tossing the empties into bins without a second thought. They smoked constantly. Half-finished cigarettes flicked aside as though tobacco were endless. To the prisoners, it was shocking, the casualness of wealth. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, once an electrical engineer for Siemens, couldn't stop calculating. In his journal he wrote, "That single rail yard must have used more electricity in 1 hour than my entire district in Berlin consumed in a day." He called it magnificent waste. Lights blazed in buildings that stood empty. Electric fans spun in rooms with no one inside. Everywhere he looked, the same message repeated. A civilization that didn't fear running out. As the train rumbled west through Tennessee and Kentucky, the full scale of American industry unfolded before their eyes. They passed sprawling factories that seemed to stretch for miles, each one larger than anything most Germans had ever seen. The Alcoa aluminum plant along the Tennessee River alone ran for 3 miles, its electric furnaces devouring 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Farther north, near Louisville, the prisoners pressed closer to the windows as the train slowed beside the Rubbertown complex, an entire industrial city that hadn't even existed 2 years before. In a mere 18 months, 4 massive factories had risen from empty fields, each employing thousands, together producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber a year. By contrast, Germany, which had invented the process, had never reached more than 120,000 tons. Even in its best year, among the watching prisoners was Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben. In a post-war interview, he remembered the shock with clinical precision. I recognized everything: the distillation towers, the catalytic crackers. But what stunned me was the scale. Each of those plants was more advanced than any facility we built in Germany, and there were 4 of them, side by side. In that moment, even the most loyal officers began to grasp what the war had hidden from them. Germany's faith in its own superiority had been built on illusion, and here, rolling past the endless glow of American industry, that illusion was breaking apart. One factory, one light, one realization at a time. They told us there were more, many more, dozens of factories just like these scattered across the continent. As the trains rolled north toward Detroit, the prisoners saw something that defied belief. Rising from the horizon was a single factory the size of a city, Ford's Willow Run plant. Built in only 9 months, it produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At its peak, 42,000 men and women worked the line, assembling aircraft made from 1.5 million parts, supplied by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant itself spread across 2.5 million square feet and consumed more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. From his window seat, Lieutenant Hermann Werle, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face to the glass. He counted 17 bombers at various stages of completion, their aluminum bodies gleaming under the daylight. "We had been told American planes were inferior," he later wrote, "that they were poorly made, rushed into battle. But I could see the precision, the discipline of the line, the strength of the frames. These were not crude machines. They were perfect, and they were endless." The deeper the train pushed into America, the faster the illusions dissolved. Every mile was another blow to the myth of Nazi superiority. Crossing St. Louis, the prisoners looked down from the Eads Bridge as barges moved slowly beneath them, heavy with grain. Below stretched miles of elevators and silos, towering like cathedrals of abundance. Each one, they learned, could feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, the son of a Bavarian farmer, recorded his disbelief in his diary. "The Americans move food the way we move ammunition, endlessly, without fear of shortage. I watched a crane load a single barge with enough wheat to feed my village for 5 years. The operator ate a sandwich thicker with meat than our weekly ration." By the time they reached Kansas City, the scent of industry had changed. Now it was meat, not metal. The train slowed beside the vast stockyards where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The air itself carried the heavy aroma of the packing plants that stretched for miles, for men who had survived on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa. On a good week, it was like staring into another world. Gefreiter Paul. Fischer later wrote, "The workers ate beef sandwiches on their lunch break. They ate meat as we ate bread. No, that's wrong. They ate meat as we wished we could eat bread." At one stop, an American guard walked to a food stand near the platform and returned with 20 hamburgers. Meat, cheese, fresh vegetables, all piled between slices of white bread. He handed them out without ceremony, paying for the lot with a single dollar bill. For the prisoners, that small gesture said more than any speech or propaganda ever could. This wasn't a display meant to impress them. This was ordinary America, a place so rich in energy, food, and freedom that even its simplest routines felt impossible to men who had lived their whole lives under scarcity and control. By the time those trains reached Texas, the war they had once believed in, the certainty of German destiny, was gone. What remained was something quieter, heavier, and far more lasting. The realization that strength doesn't come from fear or power. It comes from abundance, from freedom, and from a people who never stop building. When the German prisoners finally reached the camps, what awaited them shattered everything they believed about America. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, looked less like a prison and more like a small, functioning town. Rows of wooden barracks stood neatly aligned, each with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heating. For men who had lived through years of scarcity, this felt unreal. One of them later wrote that each barrack seemed to contain more lumber than his entire village back home. The camp hospital stunned even the German doctors among them. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, once chief surgeon of a light division, found himself in a facility that outclassed most German hospitals. X-ray machines gleamed in every ward. Surgical tools were spotless and modern, and shelves were lined with medicines Germany hadn't seen in years. And then there was penicillin, the miracle drug they'd only heard whispered about during the war. The Americans used it without hesitation, even on minor wounds. To men who had watched comrades die for lack of sulfur tablets, it was almost incomprehensible generosity. The kitchens told the same story. Prisoners assigned to cooking duty discovered a world of abundance. Walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, dishwashers, and gas stoves big enough to feed thousands. Their daily meals included milk, eggs, meat, and vegetables. Ingredients that had disappeared from German plates long ago. Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote in disbelief, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Perfectly good bread, tossed out because the rules demand surplus. I cried as I emptied the bin." By late 1943, as labor shortages spread across American farms and factories, the U.S. began sending these prisoners out to work. They were trucked through the open countryside. No blindfolds, no secrets. For the first time, they saw ordinary America with their own eyes. Neat farms, busy towns, endless machines in motion. That sight did more to dismantle the myth of Nazi superiority than any speech or leaflet ever could. They saw it all with their own eyes. Mile after mile of golden fields, endless rows of corn and wheat bending in the wind, factories humming through the night, shop windows overflowing with goods, parking lots packed with shiny cars, and neat homes glowing with electric light. Inside those homes were things many Germans had never even seen before. Refrigerators, radios, washing machines, all part of ordinary life. All part of ordinary life. Outside Houston, a prisoner named Herbert Lang watched in awe as a cotton gin devoured mountains of cotton in a single hour. More than his entire village could have cleaned in a month by hand. The machine drew power from the Colorado River Authority, part of a massive electrification effort that had brought energy to nearly every Texas farm. Lang noted quietly, "The farmer wasn't rich. He wasn't noble. He was just a farmer. Yet he had running water, electricity, a car, a truck, and machines that worked for him. Even the black laborers in the field," he wrote, "ate lunches larger than the weekly rations of German factory workers." And what struck him most, no one seemed to find it remarkable. This was simply life in America. Further north in Nebraska, the scenes were even more surreal. Prisoners sent to harvest sugar beets found machines doing the work of 100 men. The land stretched as far as they could see, vast squares of green and gold that made their homeland feel tiny. Farmers talked casually about yields twice as high as Germany's best harvests. One prisoner, Wilhelm Hoffmann, remembered a teenage boy driving a massive tractor and laughing when Hoffmann called it expensive. "That old thing?" the boy said. "We're getting a new one from John Deere soon. It's even faster." But it was the factories that finally broke the illusion of German superiority. Even though prisoners weren't allowed to work directly on weapons, they were often assigned to supporting industries, And there they saw what true mass production meant. In one Campbell's soup plant in New Jersey, German workers watched machines slicing and canning tomatoes at a pace that defied imagination. The entire factory was run mostly by women and older men. The young and strong were away fighting. Yet the plant's output surpassed what Germany had achieved in peacetime. For many of the prisoners, this was the moment of realization. America's power didn't come from arrogance or propaganda. It came from ordinary people, armed with tools, freedom, and endless energy. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, recorded his amazement in meticulous detail. Everything in the American factories ran like clockwork. Electric conveyor belts hummed along. Automatic filling machines lined up row after row, and steam cookers processed hundreds of cans at once. One elderly woman oversaw machines that would have required 50 workers back in Germany. And she did it effortlessly, sipping coffee and listening to the radio. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant caught their first glimpse of the automotive industry in full wartime transformation. Across the River Rouge complex sprawled as far as the eye could see, employing 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. Obergefreiter Franz Kellner wrote later, "We could see the parking lots, filled with thousands of cars belonging to ordinary workers. In Germany, even officers rarely owned a vehicle. Here, factory workers drove to work. Many had 2 cars, one for work, one for family. At first we thought the guard was joking. He wasn't. By winter 1943, the psychological impact of all this was unmistakable. American intelligence officers, tracking the prisoners closely, noticed what they called ideological collapse syndrome. The Special Projects Division, a secret re-education program run by the Provost Marshal General, recorded a growing trend. German soldiers were requesting access to newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Neuland, part of the monitoring team, reported in December. The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. Even the most fanatical Nazis are quiet. Loyalty to Germany remains, but talk of victory has disappeared. Many openly question everything they were told about America. Even the camp newspapers reflected this shift. Publications like Dear Roof, produced at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, slowly moved away from defiant nationalism. Articles began exploring democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. The editors, carefully chosen anti-Nazi prisoners, found their readership increasingly receptive. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter intercepted by American monitors, "We were told America was weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military power. Every day I spend here I see the opposite. It is a nation built on work, organization, and abundance. Everything we believed about them was a lie." By the time the prisoners had lived through months of this reality, the war was no longer only a battle of weapons and territory. It had become a war of perception, faith, and understanding. One that America was quietly, but decisively, winning. "This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth," one prisoner later wrote. "We were fed fairy tales by criminals." Yet the most surprising blow to Nazi ideology didn't come from battlefields or factories. It came from how America treated its enemies. When Italy surrendered in September 1943, Italian prisoners who agreed to cooperate were organized into Italian service units. They were given better living quarters, higher pay, and greater freedom. German prisoners watched in disbelief as former allies worked side by side with Americans, dined in U.S. restaurants, and some even dated American women. Hedman Friedrich Schultz recorded his astonishment. "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we ever treated them as allies. They work freely, earn money, send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own system. Then came Christmas 1943, a moment that left an indelible mark. 500,000 packages arrived for German prisoners, filled with cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games, sent by churches, civic organizations, and charities. Local communities invited prisoners to holiday dinners, though regulations often prevented them from accepting. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist choir sang Christmas carols in German. Women from the town baked homemade cookies and cakes. Boy Scouts delivered handcrafted Christmas cards. The sheer generosity and care stunned men trained to expect only cruelty. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had perished in the Hamburg bombings, wrote with quiet awe, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies, yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness." What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those who are absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power. For the German soldiers, this wasn't just unexpected. It was irreversible. Months of exposure to American industry, freedom, and now compassion had dismantled everything Nazi propaganda had taught them. They were witnessing a country whose strength came not from fear, not from brutality, but from confidence, organization, and humanity. The Christmas feast itself was something they could barely believe. Tables groaned under mountains of turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, and ice cream. Enough to make any German prisoner feel dizzy with disbelief. Many hadn't seen such abundance since before the First World War. Feldwebel Hans, scribbling in his diary, wrote, "We ate like kings, better than German generals, better than party leaders. And this wasn't special. The guards told us every American family ate this way. If they treat prisoners like this, what must their own soldiers be eating?" By early 1944, education became another instrument of transformation. Over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in programs that opened worlds they had never imagined. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and science. The University of Chicago offered correspondence courses. Professors from Stanford visited camps to lecture on democracy and economics. Soldiers who had been taught that Americans were uncultured barbarians discovered libraries filled with millions of books, universities welcoming all social classes, and scientific research leading the world. They read newspapers freely, comparing opinions, something unimaginable under Nazi censorship. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, for all humanity. They were years ahead of our research, yet they shared it with us, their enemies. This generosity was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi doctrine." Even the camp theaters challenged everything the prisoners had been told. Hollywood films, not propaganda reels, were screened. They watched Gone with the Wind, seeing Americans depict defeat, struggle, and recovery. A story that mirrored their own bewilderment. The grapes of wrath left them stunned, as they saw a nation willing to face its flaws openly and honestly, even before its enemies. For the German prisoners, each meal, each lecture, each film was a quiet but relentless education. Amerika war relentless education. Amerika war weapons. It was dismantling the very ideology that had brought them here. One lesson at a time. They hide nothing, wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. And yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here it is considered patriotic. By spring 1944, prisoner labor programs expanded as American production reached its peak. German POWs worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing the full scale of a nation mobilized. The numbers alone spoke louder than any propaganda. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners watched steel being transformed into landing craft for D-Day. The plant turned out 700 boats per month, each made from 20,000 parts, run by a workforce of 20,000, including thousands of women operating cranes, welding hulls, and managing assembly lines. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann recorded, "Women doing men's work, black laborers running complex machinery, teenagers handling drills. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. Yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They made more boats in 1 month than our entire Navy could build in a year." At Republic Steel in Ohio, the Germans watched 10,000 tons of steel poured daily. Massive furnaces burned continuously, fed by endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale was unimaginable. Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann, a pre-war worker at a German steel plant, wrote, "I thought I understood production. I was wrong. They wasted more steel in spills than we could ever produce." Workers complained about overtime while achieving in 1 day what we could not in a year, even with forced labor and double shifts. Then came the summer harvest of 1944, a final crushing blow to Nazi myths about American weakness. POWs spread across the Midwest, seeing farms that could feed entire continents. In Kansas, single farms harvested more wheat than entire German provinces. Combines moved across fields like ships over a golden sea, each machine reaping 100 acres per day. Grain elevators towered overhead, capable of holding more wheat than Germany imported in a year. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote in disbelief, "One American farmer with his machines does the work of 100 German farmers." By this point, every prisoner knew the truth. America's strength was limitless, organized, and real. And the propaganda they had believed was nothing but a lie. They showed us aerial photographs of the wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. One prisoner recorded, they could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, POWs picked fruit in orchards stretching beyond the horizon. They watched perfectly good fruit thrown away for the slightest blemish. Fruit that would have been treasured in Germany. Entire crops were sometimes plowed under to maintain market prices, a concept that left prisoners from famine-ravaged Germany in disbelief. Gefreiter Otto Schultz wrote, "Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because they had too many. We begged to send them home to our families. The guards were sympathetic but explained it was impossible. The waste was not carelessness, it was proof of unlimited resources." Then came June 6, 1944. News of the Normandy invasion swept through the camps. For German prisoners, it was the final blow to Nazi ideology. The scale of the operation: 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave, revealed an organizational capacity beyond their wildest imagination. At Camp Shelby, prisoners watched newsreels within days. Endless convoys of ships, artificial harbors, and supply systems delivering 15,000 tons of materiel daily unfolded before their eyes. They watched their homeland being overrun by the very nation they had been told was weak, decadent, and incapable of fighting. Oberfeldwebel Friedrich Fonteben reflected, "We knew then that everything was lost. Not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial myths. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against automatic weapons, courage against limitless resources. But beyond machinery, weapons, and production, there was something even more transformative: American humanity. Prisoners who had been told that Americans were sentimental, weak, and decadent discovered a people secure enough in their strength to show mercy, to treat enemies with dignity. and to act with generosity, a reality that shattered the final pillars of Nazi ideology. When Gefreiter Hans Miller learned that his son had died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message, offering condolences with quiet dignity. When Lieutenant Paul Fischer's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her. In Germany, a nation being actively bombed by U.S. forces, prisoners watched as the Americans distinguished between the German people and the Nazi regime. Hedman Otto recorded in his diary, "They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans." At first it seemed like propaganda. It wasn't. They prepared us to rebuild Germany, not to destroy it. Medical care left a deep impression. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning advanced techniques and using equipment unavailable to all but Germany's elite. Prisoners received operations that would have been impossible back home. Mental health care, almost unknown in the Wehrmacht, was offered freely. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote, "They treated attempted suicides with counseling, not punishment. Soldiers suffering breakdowns received therapy, not beatings. This humanity toward enemies revealed a strength we never understood, the confidence of true power." By March 1945, the secret re-education program had transformed tens of thousands. Over 25,000 prisoners volunteered for democracy courses. Camp newspapers ran articles on constitutional government, civil rights, and free markets. Discussion groups debated the future of Germany. Former fanatical Nazis were writing essays on democratic reconstruction. Officers sworn to Hitler were studying American agricultural techniques to implement back home. Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reichsmarschall, later admitted in 1975, "We became missionaries for democracy, not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation." We saw it work. We saw ordinary people living better than German aristocracy. We wanted that for Germany. The transformation went so far that authorities worried prisoners were too enthusiastic about American ways. Some requested to stay in the U.S. after the war. Others married American women they met through correspondence programs. Thousands would eventually immigrate in the 1950s. In April 1945, the final revelation came. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the footage was shown to POWs. Many refused to believe it at first, calling it propaganda. But photographs, newsreels, soldier testimonies, and letters from Germany left no room for doubt. The moral collapse was total. Men who had maintained pride in Germany despite defeat now faced the shocking truth. Everything they had fought for was not just lost. It was evil. Hedman Walter Schmidt wrote the clearest summary. "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually meant." As the war drew to a close in May 1945, German POWs faced repatriation with mixed emotions. They had seen an America that shattered everything they had been taught. They had eaten better as prisoners than they ever had as soldiers. They had been treated with more dignity and respect by enemies than by their own government. The final months in captivity were spent preparing them for life after the war. American authorities offered vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction. Prisoners even learned about what would become the Marshall Plan, understanding that the goal was to rebuild, not punish, Germany. Ost Friedrich von Tobin recorded, "They prepared us to rebuild our country. They gave us skills, knowledge, hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens." This generosity from victors was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi cruelty. Between 1945 and 1946, 321 to 623, German POWs were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany that was divided, devastated, and destitute. But they carried with them something invaluable: knowledge of how a free, prosperous, democratic society functioned. These former POWs became unexpected agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They had witnessed industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and democratic prosperity firsthand. Many rose to prominence. Hans Kroll, Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, Camp Koh, became president of the European Commission. Rudiger von Mar, Camp Herne, served as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackermann, Fort Robinson, led reforms in German agriculture. They brought American methods to German industry, efficiency to agriculture, and democratic ideals to politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built in part on lessons learned in American POW camps. Hans Kroll reflected in his memoirs, "We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest. We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, and that treating workers well increased production." These men returned home not only as survivors of war, but as carriers of hope, knowledge, and the promise of a new Germany. A country rebuilt not on fear or oppression, but on observation, learning, and experience. The lessons learned as prisoners shaped the foundation of a new Germany. Historians often describe the German POW experience in America as one of the most successful re-education efforts in history. It didn't rely on coercion, indoctrination, or heavy-handed propaganda. Instead, it used reality itself: American industrial power, organization, and democracy to transform hardened Nazis into future democratic citizens. The program worked because it wasn't about what Americans told the prisoners. It was what they saw with their own eyes. They witnessed a society running at peak efficiency while treating its enemies with decency and respect. They saw factories that dwarfed anything in Germany, farms producing more than entire provinces, and homes with electricity, running water, and central heating. Every meal, every electric light, every working toilet silently challenged Nazi propaganda. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a leading historian of German POWs in America, summarized it best. America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but through sheer reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The POWs were converted by prosperity. The statistics tell the story. Of the 371,683 German POWs held in America, fewer than 1% ever attempted escape. Only 2,222 attempts in total. Post-war surveys revealed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent, and thousands kept in touch with American families for decades. On the 40th anniversary of the war's end in 1985, over 500 former POWs returned to Austin, Texas, bringing their families to see the places that had reshaped their lives. Former Oberritter Hans Wehe, once held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later a physician in Georgetown, Maine, reflected, "Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, we discovered dignity." Former Stabsfeld Wiebel Kurt Meir, who had worked on Iowa farms, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes their homes. This humanity from people whose sons were fighting against us, it changed us forever." At the reunion dinner, 78-year-old former Obus Hermann Gutz delivered the keynote address, capturing the heart of the transformation. "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. But we left as witnesses to a society built on decency, efficiency, and freedom. We left changed men, carrying lessons that would shape our country for generations. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy at full production. We saw farmers producing food for the world, workers building the tools of victory, and citizens treating enemies with dignity. America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence. We returned to Germany with a mission: to build a society that could create rather than destroy, that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons learned in American prison camps. We who came as conquerors left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends. Thank you for showing us the way. The auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. Americans and Germans together, former enemies united in recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when the first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. The magnitude of the German POW experience in America is reflected not only in stories but in statistics. Camp infrastructure. Over 500 camps across 45 states, all except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. 175 main camps with 325 branch camps, built to house 250 12,000 prisoners each, with an average construction time of 90 days per camp. Prisoner population: 371,683 German POWs, part of 425,871 total Axis POWs. Peak population in May 1945. Arrival rates averaged 20,000 per month in 1943, 30,000 monthly after D-Day, and 60,000 in the final months of the war. Labor contribution: 14 million man-days of agricultural labor, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, $230 million in labor value. 1940s, equivalent to 80 cents daily wage per prisoner. POWs filled critical labor shortages in 46 states. Escape statistics: only 2,222 attempts from over 371,000 prisoners, 0.6%, with no successful permanent escapes. Most were recaptured within 24 hours. No American civilians were harmed. Educational programs: over 40,000 enrolled in courses. 135 camp newspapers published. 30,000 studying English. 15,000 in vocational training. 8,000 enrolled in university correspondence courses. Post-war impact: approximately 5,000 former POWs immigrated to the U.S., while over 12,000 maintained correspondence with American families, averaging 31 years. Many returned as tourists or business partners. Treatment assessment: 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% believed captivity positively changed their worldview. 61% expressed interest in learning about democracy. Through these numbers, the true success of the program is evident. It was not coercion, not propaganda, not punishment that transformed these men, but observation, education, and the undeniable power of a society built on freedom, efficiency, and humanity. Less than 10% of German prisoners maintained strong Nazi beliefs by 1945. The men who had witnessed America's industrial might didn't just observe history, they were transformed by it. Their captivity became education. Their defeat became enlightenment. Their imprisonment became liberation from the ideological chains of Nazism. America's greatest victory, in the end, was not won on the battlefield, but in the prison camps, where the overwhelming evidence of democratic prosperity accomplished what armies could not: the complete transformation of enemy minds. The prisoners had arrived believing in German superiority and American weakness. They left knowing the truth. American industrial might was not merely overwhelming, it was incomprehensible to minds shaped by scarcity and tyranny. The trains that had brought them into captivity in 1943 carried soldiers of the Third Reich. The ships that returned them to Germany in 1946 carried architects of democracy. They had seen the future, and it worked. Their story stands as a testament to a profound truth. The most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was not bombs or tanks, but the simple, undeniable evidence of a free society's capacity to create abundance. The German prisoners were stunned by American industry, but ultimately they were converted by it. In their transformation lay the seeds of Europe's post-war redemption and the final defeat of the Nazi dream. They returned to Germany not as defeated enemies, but as witnesses to what free societies could achieve. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s was built on foundations laid in American prison camps, where enemy soldiers learned that prosperity came not from conquest, but from freedom, not from racial superiority, but from human dignity, not from totalitarian control, but from democratic cooperation. They had arrived expecting to find a weak, divided nation on the verge of collapse. Instead, they discovered an industrial colossus of unlimited power and surprising humanity. They had come as prisoners of war, but left as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its absolute peak. In their awe at American abundance lay the psychological seeds of the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the democratic reconstruction of Germany. Democratic reconstruction of Germany. They had seen America, and they would never be the same. Their children would grow up in a democratic Germany allied with the United States, a partnership forged from the transformation that began when 1,150 Africa Corps veterans stepped off a train in Mexia, Texas, only to discover that everything they had believed was wrong. The story of German prisoners of war in America is ultimately a story of redemption through revelation. It proves that the greatest victories are sometimes won not through destruction, but through demonstration. Not through propaganda, but through prosperity. Not through hatred, but through humanity. The German soldiers who witnessed American industrial might became unwitting ambassadors of democracy, carrying back to their homeland the seeds of transformation that would bloom into one of history's most successful reconstructions. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens remains one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history, accomplished not through force, but through the overwhelming evidence of what free people could achieve when they worked together. In the end, that was America's secret weapon. Not merely the ability to produce more tanks and planes than any nation in history, but the capacity to transform enemies into friends through the simple power of example. The German prisoners had been stunned by America's industrial might, but more importantly, they had been changed by it. And in that change lay the foundation for a better, freer world.